Kia ora koutou katoa. I think we're all live right now. So welcome everyone to one of our very first master work class in ethical finance. I believe we've got about 100 people watching, so it's really exciting. But we'll get started first by asking Chris Claudel, Acting CEO of CHAR, to open with karakia, and then we'll come back to Gary to introduce our speakers.
Tina koto katoa. And on behalf of Community Housing Aotearoa, great to have you with us. Go ahead and start here. Whakataka te ho ki te uru, whakataka te ho ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai, e hi ake ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hohu, tihe, Maori ora.
Thank you, Chris. I'm Gary Moore. I co-chair the CEO Forum with Kate. Today is the first of our Raising the Game for our sector. We have a series of workshops, and this is our first we've honed in on finance. So our first speaker today requires no great introduction other than hello, Shamabeel. So Shamabeel Jacob, welcome.
Look, thank you for the introduction, very brief introduction, Gary. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'll just try and get this thing up and running because, all right, well, we can make a start. Look, the story is, I think, pretty obvious that we have a housing market that is quite broken. We need to fix a whole bunch of different things. We need to fix land supply, we need to fix infrastructure, and we need to build houses, but not just houses. We need to build houses across the continuum. For a long time, our conversation has gone from denial that there's a housing crisis to now accepting there's a housing crisis. And now we are really talking about what should that solution be. And we are making progress, but the progress is slow. The policies that are changing are very helpful. They're moving in the right direction. But the reality is the need and the accumulated kind of pressures that we have are huge. And to do that, we need to move faster, and we need to focus in particular to those who are in need. What we need is a great deal of innovation, quite a bit of courage, and quite a bit of urgency. Now, we're seeing some of these things, but the reality is that I don't think it's going to be enough unless we do more across all our sectors and we put more money, more effort across the continuum. The starting point, and I think the backdrop that was highlighted yesterday, we had the Ryan's data that came out yesterday. House prices are up nearly 30% in the last 12 months. All the predictions of the doom and gloom of the pandemic has not come to pass. Instead, what we have seen is immigration is zero, house building is at record highs, and house prices are at record highs. All the rules of the game are not working. But not only are we seeing that house prices are at extremely unaffordable levels, what we are seeing, of course, is that this very high house prices are now spreading across the country. 10 years ago, we saw most of the problems being very concentrated in our urban areas, and now that cancer is spreading right across the country. I was doing some work out in Wairoa, halfway between Gisborne and Napier, and there is a housing crisis in Wairoa, one of the most deprived communities in New Zealand. And the reason for that is they build on average 11 houses a year, and they've had this huge influx of people who've moved from all these other parts of New Zealand because they simply cannot live there anymore. The places where people used to live and work are becoming hostile to them, and we're exporting our problems to the rest of New Zealand. And this is a problem. This is a problem that is right across New Zealand, and it's going to take us some time to be able to fix. Recently, I was on TV1 talking about Wairoa, only because I think it's a really nice case study for us to kind of illustrate what's going on in the housing market and just what a big issue it is, and how these things can turn really quickly and present some of the underlying issues that we know that exist. On the left-hand side, you can see house prices. The median house prices in Wairoa is now nearly $900,000, which is an extraordinary number. For those of you who know Wellington, Wairoa used to be seen as very much the poor cousin. And that is where people who are able to sort of commute to work, our builders and our carpenters and our plumbers, there were opportunities for people who are working class to be able to live in those kinds of places. Now, not just for people to buy, but also for people to rent, which is a very important part of the housing continuum. But over the course of the last few years, what we have seen is housing costs have just gone through the roof. Back in the early 2010s, house rents were about 30% of income. Now we're looking at about 45% of income, creating huge amount of stress in places like that and creating huge amounts of gentrification. What we have seen is very, very similar to what we're seeing in many parts of New Zealand. As you know, that for a lot of the provinces in New Zealand, the big story was around population decline, how people didn't want to live in those places. Now, Wairoa was a bit like that, actually. It was exporting people for a long time. You can see that on those blue bars until about the mid-2010s, but about 7 years ago, we saw essentially we were exporting people because people didn't want to live in Wairoa. But as the Wellington grew really fast and Wellington became unaffordable, we exported our people to places like Wairoa. And that was fine because Wairoa was affordable. But what happened was we couldn't keep up with the demand increase. You can see on the right-hand side that before the 2010s, we didn't actually need to build a lot of houses. The market was in pretty good balance. But since then, demand has just skyrocketed and supply has lagged. And when supply lags like this, it creates these sort of backwash of people that are really left behind. And what it really sort of boils down to is when we build lots of houses and when we have lots of population growth, most of the new housing supply is for owner-occupiers. It is housing that is for the top half of New Zealand. It is not for the bottom half. In fact, what we have seen in the course of the last 10 years, we've seen the number of house building go up massively, but the number of rentals in Wairoa has fallen over the course of the last decade. And the rental vacancy rate in places like Wairoa has just slumped to record lows. In one of the earlier months this year, they had only 18 houses that were rented in 1 month, when the typical would be more like 100. So you can see the market's just become extremely tight, and that tightness is very much about those people at the bottom half who are getting really, really hit hard. And I think, the housing continuum is something we talk a lot about, but we don't put enough kind of numbers around it. And what we can see with places like Wairoa is that, yes, there's a whole bunch of people who own their own homes, and they're by and large okay. But the number of independent renters is actually very, very small. In places like Wairoa, close to 80% of non-homeowners get some sort of housing support, whether it's emergency housing, whether it's income-related rent subsidies, the TAS or the AS, right? These are big numbers. And what we're doing in places like Wairoa is every year, we're spending $75 million just to keep people in awful housing conditions. This is not going towards actually improving things. We got to change our thinking about not just putting people and keeping people in the kinds of conditions that they're in. It's about how do we start investing to start changing the way we do things. And that is not what's happening. We're not doing enough of the investment. So much of our housing support is about the sort of ambulance at the bottom of the cliff face and not about investments that create new housing supply. We're starting to see some policies heading in that direction, but I think the improvements are going to take time, and we all need to put our shoulders to the wheel to be able to move this forward. And I don't want to sort of take away a lot of the progress that we've made in public policy in the last decade. I know Phil Twyford gets thrown under the bus for all the failures in KiwiBuild, but the reality is a lot of the policy changes that have happened around the NPSUD, what's happening with things like the IRMA reform, the funding for infrastructure, these are good things that are going to pay dividends. And what you can see on the left-hand side is we've got a record rate of house building going on in New Zealand right now. We haven't had this kind of house building in decades. And this is really quite outstanding. We need to do this for many years. And on the right-hand side, you can see we are finally starting to increase our stock of state houses, but the numbers are still very low. We still have fewer state houses than we did in the peak in 1991. And in that chart, you can see the political, the to and fro. The right-leaning governments don't like public housing, the left-leaning governments like it. But in reality, it doesn't matter whether you're left or right. There will always be a group of people in New Zealand who are going to need support. And I think it behoves us to plan for how to look after that. The same picture that I showed you before is what's going on right now. So when we look at across New Zealand, essentially what you see is about 70% of renters in New Zealand need some sort of support. Around 400,000 people, 400,000 households need help to be able to get shelter. And that I think is extraordinary. We've got nearly 150,000 households that are in extremely crowded housing. So there's lots and lots of evidence that there's huge amounts of pressure for those people who are looking to live, and it's getting harder and harder. And the frustration that I share is not only are we spending $75 million a year in places like Wairoa, across New Zealand, we're probably spending somewhere between $3.5 and $4 billion a year on housing assistance. And that is a huge amount of money. That is only that Opex. There is so little investment, so little capex. That $3.5 billion, if we used it like a mortgage, we could spend 30, 40, $50 billion in capitalized terms. So we got to change our thinking and talk not just about the operating expenditure, but about the investments that we can make to be able to solve some of the big problems that are out there. And the big problems, I think, are being very manifest in things like the housing register. We've got over 23,000 households that are on the register. These are people who are qualified and vetted to need public housing. They're poor, they have high and complex needs, and they deserve and qualify for public housing, but we simply do not have enough public housing, whether it's provided by Kāinga Ora or by community housing providers. The reality is we are currently planning to fail. These are the projections. Over the next 3 years, these are the plans in the blue line, blue bars you can see on the right-hand side chart. That's how much the government plans to increase housing by. The orange bars is the shortfall relative to the current wait list. We know that government plans, even though they are the most ambitious we've had in many, many decades, they're still not going to be enough to be able to build houses for all those people who need it. And therein lies, I think, the opportunity for where we can all put our shoulders to the wheel. And one of the things that we've been doing in places like community finance and the community housing providers is we are providing housing for people who need it, and it's not just about the government. But to be able to do that, we need to get more capital in to build more houses. The planned increase in Kāinga Ora stock is 10,000. We should be increasing the total housing stock by 24,000. And so there is a 14,000 shortfall. To do that, we've got to change the way that we think about things. At the moment, quite a lot of support for community housing comes from the income-related rent subsidies from government and from philanthropies. And I think the way that we think about philanthropies is a very stylized approach here, but on the very left-hand side, philanthropies have a lot of capital. It's the returns from the capital that we tend to put towards good works. And that's okay, but we could do much more if we allocated some of our capital, not just the returns to that investment. That would mean that we would have enough money going into bonds and equity and all of those kinds of things that would give us that big boost. And it doesn't have to be just philanthropies that does it. In fact, the biggest opportunity is if we could get normal investors getting into this space. Housing is a fundamental human right, and right now New Zealand is failing to deliver that for too many New Zealanders. And Kiwisaver is a huge, huge opportunity. We've got more than $80 billion of money that's sitting there, and very little of it is actually working towards creating better outcomes for New Zealanders. Even a small allocation of the capital, just not the return, just the capital, would mean that we are actually building houses and we're actually supporting community housing providers who know how to look after people, who know how to provide shelter. And we know that having stable, good quality housing creates good outcomes for people. So when I think about what we're talking about today, the timing, I think, is excellent. We're seeing every evidence that the housing market is fundamentally broken. We need to fix lots of different things, but I would like us to focus on the bottom half of the housing continuum, because that's where the need is the greatest and the supply is failing the most. Our current plans, even though they're ambitious, are not ambitious enough. If we want to do this, government cannot do it on its own. We've got to get private capital in there. And if we want private capital to look after poor people, we cannot expect the same kind of returns as we expect. We need impact investing, which is about finding that right balance of returns and social outcomes. We've already seen good pilots with what we've done in community finance, for example, that this stuff works. It is entirely possible. I'd encourage you for all of you to participate in this conversation and this approach, because I think this is the way we're able to make progress going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. I had a text from my wife saying you didn't introduce Shannon properly, and I think your talk, Shannon, you introduce yourself and the ideas we need to work with perfectly, and you've set the scene for us today. So thank you very much. And we are just to remind people that at the bottom of your screen you've got submit questions, and we'd like you to be submitting questions, and Dave Sussman is monitoring those for us. So, Kate.
Wonderful. And I forgot to introduce myself because I was so excited about starting this workshop. So hi, everyone. I'm Kate Kenny from Aotearoa Community Housing Trust in the South in Christchurch, and I'm very fortunate to chair these meetings with Gary. The other thing that we'd like to do now is to set the scene for our next three presenters. So we're now rolling into what different models of impact investment could we really have for New Zealand. And to introduce that, we'd like to first ask Paul Gilbert to come on scene and just tell us a little bit more about why we're thinking impact investment.
Kia ora koutou, Paul from Community Finance. Thanks, Kate, appreciate that. I'd just like to start by emphasising what Shamabel's touched on in terms of this new phenomenon, which is not actually new at all. It's been around for centuries, this concept of impact investment, where people are prepared to use the force of finance for good. And really, to put it simply, what that means is applying finance for positive social and or environmental outcomes. And we're seeing a re-emergence of that in the New Zealand context through the sorts of work that's going on in a number of spheres. It really started off, to be honest, in the environmental space with products that are looking to deliver positive environmental impacts. And now we're seeing the bug extend into the community housing space. Now, for a lot of the people in the finance sector, they might not know even what a community housing provider is. So I think that's a useful thing to touch on, because across the country, there are about 100 of these organisations. Typically, they're charitable. About 20 of the 100 are tikanga Māori organisations who are wanting to deliver Māori outcomes in each unique context across the country. And the strength of the sector really lies in its diversity. There are a broad range of chips, from the Salvation Army through to new migrant settler organisations, to regional trusts, to national trusts. And really, I think some distinguishing features that make them the special contributor they are to the housing system really lies in their diversity and their ability to adapt to each context and to deliver the right supply side solution based on the actual context and the unmet needs that are in each community. As you've heard Shamabel talk about the issues of Wairoa, we have completely different issues in the far north, in Wairoa. And in each context, we've got to be adaptable and nimble. We've got to have the knowledge of even knowing the names of the people who are living in those houses, so that we give them the right solution at the right time, in the right place, at the right size. So that's a little bit about chips, a little bit about impact investment, and really super excited to hand over to one of the pioneers in this space, because as Shamabel has said to you, we have the ability, using New Zealand finance, particularly through Kiwisaver funds, to solve New Zealand problems with New Zealand money through the proven solutions delivered by the community housing sector. So I hand back to you.
Our next speaker is Sam Stubbs. Now, Sam disappeared off his screen for a minute, and I thought, oh my goodness. But anyway, you're there, Sam. Now, Sam was the CEO of Simplicity, Kiwisaver Fund, and has led the way in many ways of talking about ethics within the Kiwisaver investment area, and as a wonderful supporter of community housing sector. And so we welcome you today, Sam.
Look, I just wanted to thank the previous two speakers for setting the scene, and Shamabel particularly, because there's clearly a huge problem out there. At Simplicity, we're unusual for a Kiwisaver manager because we're a charity, owned by a charity. And what's really important about that is that we think over a 100-year time span, because we will never make any money. We're a non-profit owned by a charity. That means we will never be worth anything, which means we'll never be bought or sold. So we're going to be around forever. So we think about investing in a very long time frame. And so there's been a couple of references from the previous speakers now about the role of Kiwisaver. And I would say, look, this is not just Kiwisaver. If you have a look at the investable pool of money in New Zealand right now, Kiwisaver is $80 billion, but there's also another $40 billion in the NZ Super Fund. There's another $40 billion in ACC, and there's a whole lot of other, let's call it, large pools of money which are available to invest in, affordable and social housing. So you have to, and that money, by the way, will be astronomical in 10 years' time. Kiwisaver alone will be $200 billion. There will be another $200 billion of, let's call it, investment funds, other savings that people have in funds. And by the time you add on NZ Super and ACC, it'll be well in excess of $500 billion available for investment. So the question is, why hasn't any of that gone into affordable and social housing? Or why has so little gone into affordable and social housing, given that Kiwisaver has been around for 13 years now and NZ and ACC for much longer, NZ Super for longer than that? Well, if you look at it from a fund manager's perspective, a Kiwisaver fund manager, it doesn't matter how much goodwill you have towards your fellow human beings. Your fiduciary responsibility is to return the best returns, long-term returns for your members, for your investors. So you have to think about this with a investment return lens on it. Now, at Simplicity, we're a bit different. We also have a charity, so we have a charity lens on these things. But let's look at it from the point of view as where all the money is. How do you get an investment return out of this? And because if you can get a long-term investment return, the money will arrive. Well, Shamaville showed you all of those charts about the slow decline of housing, and you would have thought that, gosh, investment managers would have said, hey, housing looks like a good idea. Why don't we put some money in there? As happens in Europe, if you go to Spain, Germany, England, and so on, quite often 10 to 20% of pension fund money will be in affordable and social housing, or let's call it build to rent housing. There'll be long-term owners of large amounts of rental housing at least. Well, have a think about even a couple of years ago, we could have invested in housing, or any Kiwisaver manager could invest in housing, and we would have reasonably expected that return to be 4 to 5% in terms of what we call a net rental yield. The problem is that you would get 4 to 5% in government bonds. Housing has always been so attractive an asset class that the prices have always been high relative to other investments because it's been a tax-free capital gain. So quite frankly, the money hasn't gone in because it's just not attractive in terms of an investment return. And also there was the huge risk of what quality of housing were you buying? Were you buying leaky homes? This thing you'd have to own for 30, 40, 50 years, shares I can sell tomorrow. So why would things be any different now? Why would asset managers like ourselves look at this sector and say this is actually starting to look pretty interesting? Well, it's because of the very reason that house prices have gone up, and that's because interest rates have gone down so much. So because mortgage rates have gone down, for those who can afford the deposit, and I know there's an awful lot of people who can't, but for those who can, mortgages have made paying off that expensive house actually more affordable. So we're in this ironic situation where mortgage servicing has never been so cheap once you get the deposit in, but house prices have never been so expensive. So if you look at that from an asset manager's point of view, you say, okay, in a world where interest rates are now 1%, if I can get 3%, not 4%, if I can even get 3% long-term return, that starts to become very interesting. And the other reason it becomes very interesting is because in any market downturn there are two things that people always have to have. They've always got to pay their rental mortgage and they've got to buy food. Well, and arguably they need electricity and water and all that. But the basics in life are the bills that you will always pay first. So from an asset manager's and investor's point of view, if we own a large amount of long-term rental housing, we also know that in market downturns, that's the last bill that won't get paid. It actually makes it an even more attractive investment in market downturns. So I think what you're going to see from a Kiwisaver manager's point of view and an investment manager's point of view generally is quite a sea change towards this asset class and people starting to take it very seriously from an investment point of view because it just makes sense to put money into it now. It didn't make sense beforehand. It does now. But there's one huge issue for suppliers of capital like ourselves in terms of getting into this, and that is supply. The ability to actually purchase houses or to build houses. Because here is the issue. Housing from an investment point of view, housing is like any other commodity. It's like iron ore, it's like grain, it's like orange juice, anything that you will buy and sell in financial markets, and you can buy and sell houses in financial markets. The big issue is not demand. Demand changes over the short term, it goes up and down. Now, we've seen some structural demand changes in New Zealand as our population has increased. The big issue with any price and any commodity is supply. We have to have large-scale supply of housing in New Zealand. And the problem with Kiwisaver managers like ourselves is that if we buy supply on the open market at the moment, there are very, very few people who can supply large amounts of affordable housing to us to own for a very long time. So you actually get driven down the path. And by the way, those people who do that tend to charge a very high development margin. They tend to want to sell on the open market, not contract to us for a long term at a fixed price. It's very hard to get supply. So the trick now is, as Shamabil's pointed out, with all of this money, the trick is not supply of money. That is not the issue. There is heaps of money in New Zealand now for this asset class. The issue is, can you provide supply to the people who are writing out the big checks, the Kiwisaver managers and the ACC and NZ Super? And that's the problem with so many housing projects we see. We love them, we love the idea, but from an investment point of view, it doesn't move the needle, because we don't want to buy 10, 20 or 30 houses. We want to buy 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 homes and then rent them out. Because at that point, it becomes an asset class where you can get income, a reliable income coming in. And it is possible. So the work we have been doing over the 18 months, we've been having a very serious look at this sector. We've now concluded that it is actually possible to vertically control the build and supply of houses. So basically, you end up owning the construction company and you fund it yourself. And then you can supply large volumes of rental and arguably some for sale as well, housing into the market. But it's just going to take time. It takes time to build that capacity and deliver it. But as Shamabil said, you know, the preconditions for success are here. The demand is very clearly there. And as Shamabil said, the demand will not be satisfied under current market mechanisms. The money is now there via Kiwisaver, and it's just going to grow. It's a rising tide of money. We'll just grow, grow and grow. The issue now is the capacity, the supply. Now, on the supply side, by the way, and this is just my personal opinion, it is not land. New Zealand is one of the most sparsely populated countries in the world. There is heaps of land. There's even heaps of land in Auckland. Look at Kaingaora is sitting on 25,000 houses in Auckland, most of whom are situated in gardens. It's very old stock that can be densified. The capital is now available to do that. You just have to be able to do that capacity. So the issue with supply is not land. The issue is just construction capacity. And I think that we will get to a solution there. And I think we'll get to a large scale solution funded by Kiwisaver money over time. It won't happen tomorrow, but I'm very optimistic that it will happen. So I'll pause there and let's move on. Thanks very much for the opportunity to present.
Thanks, Sam. Sam, you raised a memory in my mind of being in New York, and a finance company took Pam and I through their investment portfolio, and one of the finance managers said the most impressive president in his lifetime was Jimmy Carter, because he made them invest in community housing. And it's the most exciting part of their investment. So it can be done, and people like you will be leading the way. So thank you very much. Right, we'll be back. And just to remind people that to ask questions, submit questions down the bottom of your screen there where it says submit question, and we will ask the speakers those questions. Right, over to you, Kate.
So I'm just going to check. Do we have Dean in the preview room?
Yes, hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yes.
Fantastic. So look, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dean Spicer. Dean Spicer is the Head of Sustainable Finance for ANZ. So it's really exciting to think that we've got an institutional banker here to talk with us about ethical finance and your ideas of what could help us solve the housing crisis in New Zealand. So thanks very much, Dean, for coming along today. Look forward to hearing your presentation.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here, and certainly I've enjoyed the previous presenters, and I think there is my comments will probably reinforce hopefully what has come before. So certainly Shamabil talked about the pools of capital out there, and that is certainly my view as well, is that there's large and growing pools of commercial funds, and they're looking for ways of investing, philanthropic foundations and dedicated impact funds. And so the challenge, I believe, is how do we bring these pools of capital together and what I would sort of think about as being a hybrid market, one where it caters for investors who are focused on impact first, as well as those who have a fiduciary duty to their clients that Sam spoke about and need to consider return of capital and return on capital. And so I think that is the challenge. And when I think back, I got involved probably about 5 years ago when there was a government pilot on testing the ethos around or theory around social impact bonds. And so we spent quite a bit of time engaged with investors of various types. I think one of the challenges at the time was it was a new concept. It was very innovative, which was great. The impact, everyone agreed, was fantastic. We were working on a number of different interventions for different providers, but the one that we finally got away was focused on reducing youth reoffending in South Auckland. And so certainly the impact was clear. But where it became tricky was the fact that it was a completely new structure and concept. When we spoke to the commercial investors, they said, well, this doesn't naturally fit within our equity or bond portfolio. So I'm not sure where it sits in terms of our mandate. And interesting enough, that was a struggle for a lot of different types of investors, even the foundations, who would say, yeah, look, we'd make a grant for this purpose, but if we're going to put it in our portfolio as an investment, then it doesn't sort of sit squarely with our existing mandates. And so I think that the learnings there is that mandates have a traditional focus on historical sort of portfolio theory around risk-adjusted returns. However, I guess what we've been hearing today is that in many ways those theories have failed to capture the impact of externalities, and so whether they are social or environmental. And so I think the really exciting part is that there is a growing awareness that we do need to consider a commercial return on investment as well as an impact return. And that was certainly my take from when I was listening to Sam's comments, that that seems to be the overriding theme that's coming through. I think that's where community finance can help in this area, because there's a number of criteria that investors want, and I think one of the learnings I've had is that we need to move at the pace that the market's ready to move at. And so if we move too far and be too innovative, it actually ends up leaving investors behind who would otherwise like to participate. So in terms of community finance, they've got an instrument that's well understood. Ultimately, it's a bond, a need that's fundamental to society, being the housing situation, and as well as, I think, touching on Sam's point around scale, it has the ability to be scaled up. So investors do have to put in the same amount of work, regardless of whether they're buying a very small investment or indeed whether they are taking a larger slice. And so that's a consideration. I think that's a game where the housing area has the benefit of being able to be scaled. So if we can find something that works, scale it up, then that has real potential. When I think about the future state of where hopefully the market goes from here, I think it's clear that the consumer is very conscious in terms of the products they're buying, the services that they are supporting. And financial services, as with other products, is where investors are very focused on where their funds are invested, and they're expecting that social return as well as an impact return. And that's coming through in terms of surveys of investors. And it's a global phenomenon. I think ultimately there has been a dramatic shift in the expectation of how capital will be deployed. I think we're going to see an increasing amount of data that ensures the provenance of these products. I think the housing space is exciting because it's, if you like, the hub of the whole area of well-being, but it has the ability to be expanded on that and to incorporate some wraparound services that are crucial for communities to thrive. Look, these trends, I think, are being reflected. We recently had a fourth annual survey in conjunction with Finance Asia, during April and May. There's 110 investors and borrowers across Asia Pacific, including New Zealand, who are surveyed. And investors are saying that, that the performance of instruments that have a sustainability aspect to them are generally performing better, particularly during periods of volatility, than other investments that aren't in that sort of category. So I think there's a real realization that not only can these types of investments be great for the portfolio from a return point of view, as well as delivering benefits to the society, but there's some added benefits from a diversification point of view as well. So look, I'll stop there, but thank you again for having me as part of the discussion, and happy to take questions if there are any.
Oh, thanks so much, Dean. That was really interesting. We've got a few questions coming through. So what we're just arranging is that once we've heard from James, I can see you there ready and waiting, we'll get our four speakers back and we'll ask the questions of them and just ask them to give us their views at that time. So, James, wonderful to welcome you to our forum, and there has been some very exciting times for you recently. So I'm sure you've been really pleased to have really great media come with the Herald article. With no further ado, I'll pass over to you to introduce the presentation.
Kia ora. Thank you, Kate, and a real honour to be here following with those wonderful speakers who I all know, and think we're very lucky as a country to have so many great people working on solving this terrible crisis we face. I just want to start with another statistic that Shamabeel taught me. He's a good friend, but he does give you stats that make it hard to sleep at night sometimes too. So one of the really Everest moments we're facing that was an eye-opener for me is just how broken this rental sector is for all of us, which obviously Sam has touched on as well. So just to show you what's in front of us, and then hopefully I'll give a bit of a message of hope too. If you were to have a cross-section of 100 rental houses across New Zealand, what's the ratio between those that can independently afford their rent and those, as Shamabeel was talking about, that need some form of subsidy? And when you actually add it all together, including the emergency and transitional on one side, to those other workers who are employed but are needing the accommodation supplement just to be able to pay rent, you actually end up with that data showing only 31 out of those 100 are independently paying their rent. So as a country, what a mountain we have to climb across this whole continuum in the affordable space. And it was because of that was really the genesis for us creating community finance. We wanted to join the dots. There's this funny factual matrix we face where we've never had more money, we've never had more need, but we also have some proven solutions. And that's the bit that I think we need to focus on. So, on this call, we have representatives from a range of community housing providers that have for decades been providing the support and the product we need. And then, as we've heard from Sam and Dean, the challenge has been, how do we get this money to where it needs to go in the affordable space? Because the private market on its own, when it exists purely for profit, is going to keep developing and building where the profits lie, whether you're a single builder on your own to a large corporation. So impact investment provides this way to unlock and build that bridge between that need, the proven solution, and the money. And so we saw a real gap here, because traditional mainstream lenders have often been a little inconsistent when it comes to lending to the community housing provider network. Often they're charities, there's grants involved, there's the risk of vulnerable people. And so either finance has been expensive or sometimes just not available to construct the new houses we desperately need. There's been also a gap on the alternatives available. So Christian Savings has done a big job stepping up for community housing providers, but what else could bring scale to the market, given we needed a lot of money redirected here? So community finance launched in 2019, and our first bond, for those that don't know, was around supporting the Salvation Army construct 118 new houses in Auckland. And so the opportunity we saw was we can create what's called a ring-fenced investment. So it allowed foundations, trusts, fund managers like Simplicity or a Generate to come in and go, all right, so I'm used to buying bonds in the open market. Why not have a bond which gets me the same return that I would be getting elsewhere, but that gives additionality to that in the form of, wow, this is helping the army create new homes for those that need it the most. So it seems very logical, but as Dean was touching on too, it's just something we as a country haven't embraced at the pace that other countries have, and yet we've got a housing crisis often worse than many in the OECD. So that's really our mission here. And this year we launched the Aotearoa Pledge as a way to keep that momentum building and to get more fund managers getting into the mode of supporting community housing providers. And we're happy to do that work in Mahi in the middle to de-risk it and make it stack up so that it meets that investment criteria and provides the return they need while lowering the cost for the community housing providers. And you know, you won't be surprised to hear that Simplicity and Sam were one of the groups that really stepped up, as well as Dean. So between them, pledging $30 million this year towards community housing projects. So I think there's also a lot of hope we need to have here. The need is staggering, and we can see the impact of poor housing on the mental health of our people, kids going from school to school to school. We have to see and understand that this is unacceptable. We need to have a collaborative approach. So Shamabel talked about innovation. I think what we're trying to bring is innovation. Many others are as well. What we need to do now is also start collaborating. And so that means with government, they're providing in the social housing space the funding mechanism through the IRRS and OS. So for those that don't know what that is, that's in effect where those people that can only afford a portion of their rent, this is where government might pay up to 75% of the rent for them. And that enables them to live at a place like Kāinga or with one of the many community housing providers. So when we've got a stable income source or rent coming from government, what we can then say as a sector is, well, if they're paying that, let's make sure there isn't a barrier to construction finance or equity here. So let's not have money as the barrier when there is so much money. So that's where collaborating with government, with the community housing sector, and starting to embrace a world where we say we want to vote with our money for a financial return and for doing good. So I'd just like to end this part by also saying there is a resource for those that are interested where your own Kiwisaver money is invested, and that's called Mindful Money. And that enables you to compare where you currently have your funds to some of the other options. So for example, with Simplicity, you could look them up and see what they're doing. And I'm very proud of what they're doing there. So impact investing is about positive impact and helping us invest in new affordable housing, but there's also negative screening where we're limiting the harm that we cause in other investment classes.
Thanks. That was just fantastic. And I think one of the things that's coming through quite clearly is the finances available. And I think one of the challenges for the community housing sector is the organisational structure that the financiers require. And we as a sector need to be listening to this and saying, right, and it's similar to what the Governor of the Reserve Bank told us a few months ago at the CEO Forum. But I think one of the things that's really important is that we must remember that Otago University study, all of us, bankers, community housing people, is that the stability for children is totally dependent on them having stable housing. And we must live that out, and it's our responsibility if we must stabilise housing, and the community housing sector is the housing sector's moral conscience. So, but one of the things too that you reminded me of, James, was Kay Saville-Smith has done some amazing work, particularly on the accommodation supplement. And I would recommend to Dean and Sam to actually have a read of Kay's. In fact, I'll make sure that you get a copy of her research, because one of the things that is a possible solution is capitalisation of accommodation supplement. That's going to require a political will, but in fact it's been done before. My mother capitalised her family benefit, and we bought a house, and I think that can be done again. So anyway, we've now got a number of questions. Just to remind people that if you look down the bottom of the screen, the blue bit that says submit question. So we've got a few questions, and Kate will start.
So Alex Skinner, chairperson of Aotearoa Community Housing Trust, was first in with a question. Thank you, Alex. Look, just for everyone viewing, we've asked our presenters to all come back on the screen, and we'll put these questions to you and just see what your thoughts are on what's coming through. So the question is, why doesn't New Zealand establish central charities that build up to 3,000 properties through CHIPS, and then Kiwisaver could fund them, rather than CHIPS trying to do it alone? Wonder if I could pass that first to you, Shamabeel, and then to you, Sam, for your views on that question.
I think partly it's because there is a lot of fragmentation in the chip sector, just because of the way it was set up. So the history of our chips is, actually, we didn't really like them very much, if you know what I mean. So we relied on them to do a lot of work, but we made them run on the smell of an oily rag. And that division and fragmentation was very, very deliberate. So in some ways, I think that scaling up is something that will need to happen. But for that, we need to have that certainty of income and the certainty of capital. Those things currently don't exist. And that needs to be provided by political will. And none of those things have really existed. And I think that's something that we have to work towards. Realistically, if we want to deal with the scale of the problem that's there, we cannot have the level of duplication and fragmentation that we have in the chip sector. So it is something that has to change, but we are kind of dealing with the history of what we have done. The only sort of big scale community housing provider is, of course, Wairoa, which is not a community sector organization, rather a government organization.
I'd like to challenge just the last bit of what you said, Shamabeel, because I see Wairoa and community housing sector being in the same realm. I think it's been differentiated too much, that we perform different roles, but I think we're there together.
Well, I don't think you are. I don't think the way that we're treated is the same. We're not given access to the same capital. We're not given access to the same powers. So no, I don't agree that the chips have the same level playing field as KO. If anything, we're very much the poor cousin, and they're planning to fail. They're planning to build 10,000 houses in the next 3 years, and we need to build 24. And that 14 has to come from chips, and we're not giving the power and the resources for that to happen. So I think this fragmentation is deliberate. And if we want to fix it, we're going to have to give a lot more resources for the community housing sector to deal with it.
Okay, Sam.
Oh, thank you. Look, I'm going to give you a very personal view, or that I should say the view of simplicity, which is that if you have a look at our role here, the work we've done for community finance and providing the money, it's been fantastic what James has done. That is, I think, scalable to a certain extent in the sense that we've
Sam, you've gone silent on us.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So I think there are two ways we look at it. One is that if CHIPS continue to provide housing and they continue to ask us to invest as a supplier of debt, so we buy a bond, which James has done really well, that is vanilla and easy, and we can carry on doing that, and that becomes a substitute for fixed investments. The problem with that is that, as Shamabeel talks about, it's a very fragmented business. So the chips have fantastic heart and intent. The problem is, how do you get the volume through? So there's and if you think about Kiwisaver now, we need to invest billions of dollars in this sector, not tens of millions. So the issue is capacity. So then you talk about, okay, how do you build and scale? And then you talk about, okay, well, if we were to own it, so rather than providing finance and the chips own it, if we were to own it ourselves, here's the problem we have. If we outsource that to anyone, no one can build in that volume. And even when they build in that volume, even if they're a developer, what they do is they develop to own, which is 50 years. 50 years is not long. We're going to be around for 100 years. If we build and own a house, I want to know that it's going to last almost forever. So we will spend the extra 5 to 10% in order to get that building to last 100 years as opposed to 50, because if we're going to be owning it for that long, that's a good, sensible financial decision. So the market cannot supply us stock. It's hundreds and hundreds of thousands. If you have a look at this, what pension funds do overseas, they do not buy cheap houses. They build houses because that's a good long-term strategy. So that leads us down to buying markets and buying markets. But as we do this, buy them themselves, own the construction company themselves, build their own homes, and then become one supplier into the market. Now, that doesn't mean we won't carry on funding chips. We will. If chips can carry on providing investment opportunities like James has done, we'll carry on funding those. That's fine, because that's a fixed interest investment. Perfectly cool. But the solution for real volume, I think, is we've got to do it ourselves as well.
Look, I've got a question here that really follows on very nicely. So I'm not going in the order the questions have come in, but we have a question from Peter Freeman. And Peter, it's great that you're on the call. Peter suggested that, so coming back to the construction companies, following on from Alex's question, we have a handful of construction companies that build around 400 homes a year. How does a panel hope to deliver them in thousands? And again, the idea, I'd like to tease out what you were saying, Sam, earlier about, do you need to own the construction company so that you can get the volumes out? Is this something that is an investor play, or is it a partnership play? So if you have some thoughts on that, and any other of our presenters as well, please.
Sure. Well, from our perspective, we're control freaks on this. Because if you look about contracting this out, if you went to the biggest construction companies, the person who submitted the question is right. You know, if I went and put an order out for 10,000 homes, no one can supply that. Or if they supply it, they can supply us 50-year homes built to code, custom built for the area with a lot of local income. As soon as you customize things...
Lean forward, Sam.
Sorry, I don't know what's wrong with this program here. But anyway, if I put an order out for 3,000 homes now, nobody could supply them. And even if someone said they could, they would supply us with 50-year homes. They would tend to be custom built according to the region, and everyone would have a view about how they wanted them to look, feel, and operate. We have to be complete control freaks in this one. We have to control in order to get serious volume, we have to control the entire process. Sorry, can you hear me now? Yeah. So that's the problem. The problem is not the supply of money. The problem is the capacity to build. And the capacity to build is because the New Zealand construction industry for the last 100 years has grown up around building a customized home for the person who wants it, or for the buyer, in small volume, with lots of, a phyllo pastry of fees from various suppliers. The last time we built in real scale, good, solid, warm, dry homes was when the last great state housing boom back in the 1930s. Now, interestingly enough, it was Fletcher's that did that. It was a private company that did it, but they did it with a massive order from the government for standardized housing, so they could build capacity in real scale. No one's doing that yet. So if we do this, we'll continue to love and support chips with financing. But if you want us to own these things and run them, we'll have to do it ourselves, because no one else can do it.
Very interesting, Sam. Can I ask Dean James Shannon, is there anything you'd like to add on that question?
And see how other countries have addressed this capacity issue. And look, I'm no expert, but it does appear to me that we are seeing off-site manufacturing, which is able to provide housing at scale. The challenge you got there is if you want someone to put the capital in here, they need to have some sort of certainty of demand. And so it's it seems like we've got a chicken and egg story where we can't get the scale, but because we don't have anyone who can deliver it. On the other hand, if we wanted to find other ways of manufacturing, we'd actually need to be able to give confidence of demand, which we seem to have plenty of. So that sort of strikes me as an opportunity that could work. I would like to just touch on one other thing. One of the questions earlier was around which we haven't touched on yet, was around liquidity and the impact on that. And that sort of ties back into this whole area, because there is a cost for illiquidity, because investors will look at it and say, look, if something's of a similar risk but there's less liquid, then there's going to be a liquidity premium added. And so I think, coming back to one of the earlier questions, look, there is potentially other ways you could address the funding issue. Local government has come together as a collective, but then they do cross-guarantee each other's debt, so they hold arms together and get the benefit of scale from funding in that sense. So look, I think there are iterations. I think the fact that community finance has started is awesome, and I think there'll be ways that can drive scale and hopefully improve liquidity, and that will drive benefits to the whole affordability of capital going forward as well.
Quickly on the capacity of the construction sector, I think it's a red herring. In Canterbury, we built at a record rate over a very short period of time. And if the demand is there and the capital is there, then the businesses will scale up. Just like we did in the post-30s, post-40s, when Fletcher Building scaled up. It was there because new developments were underwritten by government. That underwrite was never called. So there are ways of doing this. So if the demand is there and the funding is there and the demand is secure, absolutely, the building sector will scale up. I think we shouldn't worry about that stuff. There's plenty of people out there who'd like to make a buck out of building houses for people. That's not the problem. The problem is the willingness to actually de-risk it and to create the certainty of demand and funding.
Can I just say something as well about? I mean, I'm not sure I agree with Shamobeel on that, because we have a checkbook ready. We can't find anyone who would build in the volume that we would.
Time, Sam. It does take time, like we did in Canterbury, but it will happen.
Yeah, it does. That's true. So that's possible. And long term. Can I just address the on-site manufacturing issue? Because in our investigation of the sector over the last 18 months, one thing I've discovered is there is no silver bullet. So some people say it's on-site manufacturing. Some people say if it's KO, just release more land, or if the city's expanded, or if they change the resource planning. All of these people always have. A lot of people have one thing that has to happen, and somehow miraculously this will change. Off-site manufacturing, to give you an example, if you look at the materials and labour costs for the construction of an average home in New Zealand at the moment, bespoke home, guess what percentage that is? The actual materials and labour. It's 12%. So off-site manufacturing, even if it saved 50% of costs, and it doesn't, but let's assume it does, price of houses would go down 6% if every house was built on off-site manufacturing. So we can actually do all of this with everything that we already have available. We don't need a miracle new technology. We don't need a massive change in laws or regulations or whatever. But what we do need is scale thinking about it, not bespoke thinking. And which is what I think Shamobeel is talking about as well. As long as the suppliers of capital, as long as the construction companies and the demand people are talking much bigger numbers than we're talking, then everyone will gear up and get ready for it.
Yeah, no, thank you. And some really good points there. I think to Sam's last point, the reality is there are barriers for us doing this across the whole supply chain. And that's why we've seen the issues we have. In the space we're playing in finance, that has just been one barrier. You solve that without solving the others, it isn't fixed. The thing here that we've learned as well is we have an ever-increasing number of people across this housing continuum that needs certainty of tenure and an affordable, warm, dry place to rent. And so, yes, there's a focus on the community housing sector here, but actually, as Sam was saying, we actually do need this build-to-rent sector to come in on a big scale as well. So the construction sector needs to be able to meet that need, but we need to find that way to actually create these investable classes to meet the need of our people and to give those people who have a job, who don't need to necessarily get government subsidies, but who can't afford to buy a home right now, they're in no man's land, as you could see from those Wairoa slides from Shamobeel. So how do we do this? Well, the answer is, I think as Shamabil said, we need to create the demand so that businesses that are in each sector can and will gear up. And I think we also need to give ourselves time. All the stats show that over 30 years as a country, we made a lot of mistakes and underinvested across the whole spectrum. If we say, let's give ourselves 15 years to fix this, that's probably the right time frame. We're not going to fix this in 3 or 5 years, but we have to start right now saying, let's bring in build to rent. Let's start financing the community housing providers that have spare capacity, and let's do this nationwide because the housing crisis is in each region. And for some of those regions where there isn't the labour, that's where you can use something like prefabrication. There's a wonderful entity called Build Smart out of Huntly. It's been operating for 30 years. I think they can do around 400 houses per annum. Forgetting whether it's more efficient from a cost point of view, what a wonderful tool to be able to say we can get a truck to deliver that house to an area of need if we're waiting for that region to gear up and get those builders so that there is the labour. So it's about lots of solutions and the right solutions for each region or community housing provider. And let's stop letting barriers be an excuse, because if we collaborate, we can do this.
Much everyone, and that gives us lots to sort of follow up on through that conversation. We've got a question here from David Shand. What other strategies are available to de-risk investment in social housing apart from the government-funded rental support schemes? Who wants to have a go at that one?
It's Sam here. I've got one other idea. I think is the affordability of the housing de-risks itself in the sense that if you can build cheaper in volume and whomever the owner is therefore has less risk because it's more affordable, so more people can afford it. So I think there's a real one of the crunch points I think here is being able to build affordably, and that means, quite frankly, a lot cheaper than the market can currently supply homes. And so we've been spending a lot of time looking at that. How do we get really high quality homes that are much cheaper? And a lot of people say you can't do that. Well, we have the sort of attitude to that we had when we set up Simplicity. Now, they said you couldn't set up a non-for-profit Kiwisaver that would charge a third of the fees of our competitors. Well, we've done it and it's working. So I think the finance industry is pretty much the same. I've used this phrase before. Our observation of the housing market in New Zealand is just a phyllo pastry of fees and subscale options all the way through. So de-risking it is building better, cheaper homes.
We've got a couple of really good examples in New Zealand where community housing trusts have taken land out of the mix. One's in Queenstown, with the Queenstown Housing Trust, and the other's up in Kaitaia with Ricky Houghton, where nobody can own the land. And taking the land out of the mix has actually provided a very interesting model, one in Queenstown, one in Kaitaia. And that's one, if you look at as a sector, we've looked at who's got the land, central government, local government, churches and iwi. And if we can start seeing, like a big part of the cost that you're talking about, Sam, is land.
Then one of the things we're investigating, and please do not send me a lot of emails with offers of land at this stage, but one of the things we're investigating is we don't need to own land. We could lease it long term. A 125-year lease is effectively ownership from an economic point of view. We could construct, own and operate, build, own and operate, and then give the development back to the landowner in 125 years' time, so they don't have to sell the land, which is, and that's a very important emotional issue for a lot of landowners in New Zealand, regardless of the economics involved.
Thanks, Sam. Look, there's just two more questions we want to get through. We were trying to answer in an hour, but they're so valuable to have our four presenters here today and to be giving opportunities to those people listening to ask a bit more. The one I've got here right at the moment from Charles Waldegrave, most of the examples so far have referred to rental housing. This does not address the asset equities that are growing in New Zealand. Could we build equity into this sort of investment that enables greater control and independence for middle and low income families? Building in shared equity, rent by low interest, fixed mortgages, etc. So if I could throw that question to our presenters, please. Indeed, housing is something that institutional bankers have probably spent some time wondering about where they are in that space.
Look, it's a good question, and I think it's something that, well, it is something that we are looking at in terms of what other models there are that can be designed to address these issues. I think it's fair to say that when I think about it overall in terms of how the work that the Aotearoa Circle did looking at the Sustainable Finance Forum and the gaps there, there's a number of gaps. This is one of them. I think there's many others, and I think ultimately as a sector, as an industry, then we do need to find ways that we can sort of close the gaps. And I think when you look at the definition of a sustainable financial system, that is the long-term objective, then it's about financial inclusion, and so that's going to need new ways of thinking and new products to go with that. I think there's definitely a need to address that issue, and I think again it's probably one that James can talk to in terms of thoughts around this as well. But it can be delivered. There's mechanisms for it. And I think it's so I'd be hopeful that this is something that we will see develop.
Jump in very quickly on this. Yes, you're right in that it would be nice to give people that ownership stake and those kinds of things, but our housing market is so fundamentally broken. Our house prices are so fundamentally expensive that pretending that we're going to be able to get people into home ownership in any near-term future when their incomes are so low is not realistic. Our first aim should be to give people security of tenure, a place that they can call home, where they don't get kicked out. Their kids can go to the same school. Those things should be our first priority. Yes, we should think about those other things in time, but the reality is that I don't think we'll be able to do that with any scale and effectiveness soon. So even with the amazing programs that folks like the Housing Foundation do, really great programs, but it's a real struggle to be able to scale that stuff up. So look, I think, yes, we should aim for those kinds of things in the future, but not when house prices are on average close to $1 million in places like Wairoa. I think we're dreaming if we think we're going to be able to do that anytime soon.
We could move to the South Island.
Well, we are exporting our people to all the places that don't have the resources. So, yes, we could move to other places, but if you don't have the jobs and opportunities, then we are actually trapping people into a quality of life away from their families and their networks, which is not good either. So look, yes, people already move. Christchurch and the greater Christchurch area has had record levels of net migration since the earthquakes. People are moving there because housing is affordable, there are good quality jobs and good quality of life. That's fine. But even there, we have growing numbers of people on the housing wait list. Even there, we have a shortage of rental properties. Even there, rentals are getting unaffordable. Because you know what? We're doing it so badly everywhere. Even in the most successful region, which is Greater Christchurch, housing is expensive. So for those very vulnerable groups of people, I think, yes, we should keep that in mind of ambition, but I don't think we'll be able to do that soon. It's simply been neglected for too long. So we've got to take it in sequence.
But there's a really good question here from someone who has a lot of expertise in this area. So again, it's Peter Freeman saying offsite does not save dollars, but it does save time. And we've got to move from bespoke, as you've said, Sam, to mass production. But Peter's making a very strong statement that we must stop doing individual designs with individual specifications if we want cost-effective delivery. I would like to ask our presenters, how hopeful are you in seeing us almost have a standardised product that could be used again across New Zealand? And how hopeful are you that a government underwrite would allow us to start getting scale, as you've talked about now? And again, while we're looking at what we can do with private investment, is private investment also going to need some kind of guarantee from the government as we scale up?
The prefab place that can do, I imagine that if you went to, same company, and there was a long-term offtake agreement for the 400, or maybe even for 1,000, that would give the confidence to scale up production. And so I think it's not so much an underwrite in the sense of the word I sort of see that as just having long-term procurement certainty for that offtake. And I think if we gave that, you would mobilise the investment to make it happen.
I think it's a good point, Dan. The big thing here is it's about what can we do and control as private sector, and what is it that government can and will do in its role. The more we can give confidence and de-risk things, theoretically, the more you can do. But actually, with some of the existing policy settings, I think we can do a lot more with the community housing sector, as is with what the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development is already doing. So that's a real positive. If you're looking at something like build to rent, the reality is, as Shamabeel has shown, we know that there's the demand there. So the reality is, if we can create these asset classes so that investors can put the money into it, then actually we can do this right now. Would government underwriting or de-risking help? Yes. Do we need it to achieve what we've talked about in this call? No. So I think the big thing here, hopefully that's a bit of a message of hope. We can start doing this. We can spend a lot of time talking about construction. If the chips want to, or the BTR operators coming in want to, they can do standardized design. I mean, the nice thing is we do control what the outcomes are here. It's just that if you use the normal home builders, which will work with the wealthier end of town, they are going to do their own bespoke builds, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Is that going to solve the crisis for people with low incomes? No. So we just shouldn't use it.
I have a very strong view on this now, having looked at it, for 18 months. There are going to be multiple solutions, but the private sector needs no help from government. It just needs it to basically, sell it land if it has land it wants to sell to build the stock it does, and then, from our perspective, the more parties you get involved, the more complex it gets, and the more expensive it gets, and the less that gets delivered. So from the private, Kiwisaver funded side, I hate to sound like Ronald Reagan here, but government is not the solution. Too much government is the problem. You've got to let the market, and I know the market has failed miserably in doing this, but let's call it the well-intentioned private suppliers, I think now are going to come on in force. And as Shamabeel already pointed out, consents are already at record levels. It's starting to happen. I don't think we need to be over-engineering this at all.
Shamabeel, you want to?
Look, I'm very optimistic about optimization in the sense that standardization of buildings is going to happen when you've got a big institutional builder. You're not going to get it from mom and pop buyers of housing, which is what happens at the moment. Most people individually buy houses. We don't get the large scale builds, right? And it's when the institutions become involved in actually building houses, as we get in the property sector, in the commercial property sector, for example, there's a lot more economies of scale. So it is absolutely going to come, but it's the chicken and egg. We got to get the institutional sector building houses. It cannot be left to that fragmented owner occupiers building houses for themselves. And like I said before, yes, we're building record number of houses, but a majority of them are built for people who are going to own or occupy. It is not designed for the renters. It is not designed for affordable. It is not designed for social. And therein lies the gap. But I think it is going to change, but it's really about how do we. I'll disagree a little bit with Sam in that there is a missing right now. To get that going, the government can do something. It can be a catalyst. And that catalyst should be to create a regime that says build to rent is a property class like it is with retirement villages. Give it all the same privileges, all the same rights to make it something completely different. That would make a huge, just go for it and know that you've got the legislative framework to both regulate the quality of service we provide, the standard of buildings, and all those other bits and pieces, and it removes us from all that other stuff that goes in the housing market in general. So look, I think the government can do a thing, and that thing that they need to do is create the catalyst and the enabling environment to create a build-to-rent sector that is, that comes to fruition.
Well, If you could do that, Shamabeel, that'll take us from very enthusiastic to extremely enthusiastic. So go for it.
Trying, Sam, trying.
Okay.
Right. Now we've got 12 minutes left. We've got a whole lot of questions that we'll go away and try and maybe circulate some of those to our presenters afterwards so that we can get feedback for people.
What I would say, Shamabeel, you just answered quite a few of the questions right then when you talked about how we get the build to rent work. And so there's 3 or 4 questions I've read through and you've immediately put out an option. So that was incredibly helpful. Thank you.
There are many options, Kate. We already have the tools. We have the underwrite that has not been used. We've got Kaingoa that's got land that it can sell to people like Sam and go, Sam, if you build affordable rental houses, we'll sell you the land cheaper than market rate. And you know what? Sam would go and build houses on that. Is it happening? No. So we've got the mechanisms in there. And I think there is a lot of talk about this stuff. I don't think we need to over-engineer it. So I agree with Sam on that. We don't need to go too far. We just need to make sure we create the enabling environment and just give it a little bit of a nudge to get it going. It doesn't need that much.
We've got some questions that we're going to put up on the screen, hopefully now. We've got 3 questions for people to write an answer in the submit question box. If you can. Question number 1, from the presentations today, what areas or issues are the most important for CHAR and the CEO Forum to follow up in action? So question number 2, what finance options do you see working well in the future and what is working well right now that we can do more of? And the question 3 is how can you in your context change mindsets and behaviour in favour of growing impact investment for affordable housing in Aotearoa, New Zealand? That is really about what are your networks, how can we encourage people to invest in the sector? And we've had those in the industry saying, hey, yes, we'll do it. How do we do that? So those are the 3 questions, and we'd like you over the next 8 minutes and 45 seconds to answer that. But what I would like to do now is to thank our 4 presenters for the challenging and wonderful stuff that we've had to talk about this morning. And I was really thinking, and I don't know how you want to respond, Kate, but I sort of couldn't help thinking we're all citizens in this challenge together, and this is how are we going to prepare for those who follow us? And I think that as a community housing sector, we're, as I said earlier on, the conscience of housing, and we need to actually tap into the conscience of finance, and we need to tap into the conscience of the community so that we actually provide for those who follow on from us, for our children and our grandchildren. So I'd like to just thank all the presenters from me about that. So, Kate.
Yeah, I can't thank Dean, Sam, Shamabeel, Paul and James enough for taking the time to be here today. You've really provoked some thinking for me, and I think there's about 100 people watching. Looking at the questions that are just piling through now, you've got a lot of people thinking. What we'd like to do from here is have this as the start of a conversation. We need to actually do as everyone has asked. We need to get the momentum happening. We need to get the levers in place so that we do work together to solve this housing crisis. Looking at what's coming through at the moment and trying to do a quick read, we've got things happening. So I'll be asking CHAR, who have been so fantastic in supporting this forum, to pull the themes together so that we can potentially have a follow-up workshop. Our next workshops are on different topics, but this one is the one that is going to make the biggest impact for our sector. Ethical investment, more houses for people who really need them. That's why we're all here. And I do hope that we can find ways for us all to work together so that we can actually use your valuable ideas today to help us all solve this crisis. I'm thinking, is there any last comments from any of our presenters before we close this session?
The thing that came to mind as I was hearing everyone talk is I think there is a reasons to be optimistic, and as James said, there's things we can do now, and with the right levers and collaboration between everyone, then I think there's a lot that can be done. So thank you for allowing me to be part of the discussion. I enjoyed it.
And I'll step off the pulpit and get on with building some houses.
James?
Yeah, just thank you, everyone. I think the thing is, there's always mixed emotions with these, isn't there? Because you look at the state of our country and you want to weep, but then you see how many amazing people and community groups are saying, actually, let's scale this up and do something about it. So I think the message here has to actually be one of hope and that we will do this. And I think we just have to, when we see a barrier, we have to say, well, how do we innovate and solve it? Because I don't think there's anything that's stopping us from doing this now. To Dean's point, we can collaborate and do this between the private sector, working with the government. We need clarity from government that we can, with certainty, get investors into things like build to rent and actually get the money that's needed to make that meet the demand and the need. When it comes to community housing providers, decades of doing right by some of the most vulnerable in the community, we all have to back them. And that's one of the real joys of our job at Community Finance, being able to get money to groups that have proven solutions that are making it work with government funding. So we just need to get on and do this at a scale we haven't done before, and what a challenge and what an opportunity. So thanks everyone, and well done for all the presenters and also putting it together, Char and the shift. Thank you.
Shannon.
Look, in some ways, I'm tired and exhausted about the housing crisis. It just gets worse and worse every fucking year, right? And if we're going to make things better, we can't wait for other people to make it better. The reason why I participate in things like this is because we got to mobilize private capital and private folk to do the right thing. We can't rest on the goodwill of our politicians, because you know what? They've shown us over the last 40 years that they are willing to fail. So if we want to make a difference, we have to use our capital, our funds, to be able to do this.
Well, I'd like to say, Gary and I think you're all fabulous. Thank you so much for your time. Believe us, we'll try not to send too many emails to you with all our ideas after these sessions. Could we ask Chris to close off this wonderful session and the gift you've given us all with the time we've spent here with Karakia? Thanks, Chris.
Thank you very much, Kate and Gary, for keeping the conversation going. Lots of ideas out here, some great things coming through on the chat, and we will be following up with all of that. And of course, for folks who can come back, the recording will be on the conference website. And this is just the first in a series of these masterclass events that we'll be holding, in addition to some regional events until we conclude in October. So again, thank you very much to the presenters for giving of your time, your talents, your energy, your thoughts. You've given us a lot to work on in the future. And so now I'd like to close this off. Kuamutu o mato mahi, matine wa, manakatia mai mato katoa, mo mato hoa, o mato whanau, aio ki te aorangi.